5 hosts, 4 divisions, all battling it out for the Holy Grail of the American Hockey League, the Calder Cup. This is the Holy GrAHL podcast. Here are your hosts, Zack Power, Andrew Rinaldi, Corey Swartz, and Dina Weinheimer.
Hello and welcome to the Calder Cup Final edition of the Holy GrAHL here on Field Pass Hockey. Now, this is the episode for June the 9th. As we get ready for Calder Cup Finals action, we're going to go around the table like we normally do, and we'll start with an introductory question, and it's a very simple one for Corey this week. Corey, is that a playoff beard I'm spotting?
It is a playoff beard. I decided to let it go after I'm a superstitious person when it comes to the Calder Cup playoffs. And, I think it was the first game against the Rochester series. I had let it grow a little bit before that, and they lost. And so I've shaved it at one point in the past, and I was like, you know what? I shaved before this game. Now it has to grow. So this is however long it's been since game 1 of the Rochester series. Not all the way, but, I figured I'd let it go. It's a perfect excuse to try to see how much I can do.
And it's going pretty good. I used to have something similar as a kid. My mom, on like Halloween and stuff, she used to like rip open like a tea bag and dip it in water and you put it all around. That's where you kind of got going. This comes from me where I can't. This has been like a week, man. Like I'm doing pretty good here. But enough of that shenanigans. We have lots of good things to get to this week here on the Holy GrAHL, and we'll be talking about that playoff series that Corey kind of alluded to between the Coachella Valley Firebirds and the Hershey Bears. But first, we'll start by getting into the news of the week. Lots of good things happening around the AHL, including Rochester's Lawrence Pilut is off to Europe on a 2-way deal. Now, he was a really critical piece, and he was very quick going. So, one would kind of have to imagine that this is something that's kind of been brewing in the works. And that D-man scored 3 goals and 25 assists during the 47 games played. A really good up-and-comer for the Buffalo organization, and it's tough to see him go. Another tough to see him go in that category as well, and maybe for some good things, is Greg Cronin of the Colorado Eagles has been promoted to the Anaheim Ducks, where he will now become the bench boss of that organization. And obviously that organization has had a relatively tough couple of years. Didn't really get what they wanted in the draft lottery, I'm sure, but they did get a fantastic coach who just came off of a really good season, as well as a solid playoffs where they got knocked out by someone who's going to the finals. So what can you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And on a more somber note here, we did have some news as Hershey was playing game 6 against Rochester the same day. Willie Marshall, the American Hockey League's all-time leader in goals, assists, and points, and was a charter member of the league's Hall of Fame, passed away this week. He played for a number of teams, most memorably, of course, for me, the Hershey Bears, Pittsburgh Hornets, the Rochester Americans, Providence Reds, and the Baltimore Clippers. Nobody's yet to touch his record in points. He has 1,375 points in 1,205 games played. It was very tough news to get on the same day as Hershey's playoff series. One of the greatest legends in the American Hockey League from a different time. We probably won't see anybody like him ever again, I would assume. He's a kind of guy that nowadays would be more than likely to be going on to NHL success. But, just the way it is now, it's a lot different. And, we pass our condolences on to his friends and family in this really tough time.
Yeah, and one of the tributes I've seen on Twitter, he really was the AHL's Wayne Gretzky, right? That guy, and you know what, and good on him too for doing all that. My condolences to his family, his friends, everybody who knew him. And the AHL definitely did lose a key figure over this past week. Moving on now to the Central Division, where Curtis McKenzie has signed a 2-year AHL contract to the 2024-25 season with the Texas Stars. Now, actually, I didn't realize how extensive of a resume he does have 523 AHL games played. In that time, 167 goals, 236 assists. He made his AHL debut during the 2012-2013 season. He did win the Calder Cup with the Texas Stars there in 2014.
Yeah, and another little bit tidbit to pass on. Speaking of players, you mentioned earlier about Lawrence Pilot, who went off to Europe. We've had a few instances of seeing some rumors like that. It was a strong rumor that current Hershey Bears goaltender Zack is similarly off to the KHL overseas there next season. That it was announced that there was a plan in place to sign him over there as soon as his time with the Bears and the Washington Capitals organization has passed. It kind of leaves Hershey in an interesting but not overly interesting spot, if that makes sense, because the Bears still have a ton of goaltenders signed in their system. Mitchell Gibson is the one that sticks out to me that still gives them 6 goaltenders from top to bottom. Now, obviously, that's assuming that Hunter Shepard signs with the organization for next season. Not a guarantee, but certainly an amicable situation over there too. But of course, with a run like this, he's bound to garner interest, and there'll surely be some teams jockeying. So it kind of leaves Hershey in an interesting place. It's one half of guys that basically split the regular season evenly. I sense a promotion for Clay Stevenson is in the works, though, as a result.
And now you kind of mentioned it a little bit off air and in the chat earlier this week. Was the writing kind of on the wall for Fucale during this?
I think it was there, yes, a little bit. And it's nothing against him. He's a great guy, fan favorite in Hershey, very beloved there. But the Capitals have had issues in the past where they've given they've had too many goaltenders, right? We saw it with Logan Thompson. It's not a very well-known fact, I think, outside of people that were, have been in Hershey and fans for quite some time, that, Logan Thompson was actually a Bear for a brief period of time. He spent, a whole season with the South Carolina Stingrays. I always remember, because I do have a video of him playing a preseason game for Hershey in the 2019-20 season. But, the Capitals had simply too many goaltenders. Another team offered him a, better contract, that being the Vegas Golden Knights, and he worked his way up to, their starter until, he was unfortunately knocked out. It's easy to forget now with where Vegas is at with Adin Hill in goal. But, I don't think the Capitals are eager to have that sort of situation rear its ugly head once again. So I think that it's kind of, they're playing their chips as well as they can without, hemorrhaging any goaltenders. And it is pretty rare to have, 6 goaltenders, top to bottom in any organization under contract at the NHL level like that too. So it's truly a testament to, how strong Washington's system is. I think if you're a goaltender, it's a place you want to be in many ways too. So I think it's just simply a case, like Phoenix Copley before him, there's just too many goaltenders right now.
For sure. I remember seeing him coming out of juniors. There's a lot of comparisons for him to Carey Price. He came out of the World Juniors. He played with the Halifax Mooseheads. Everyone was thinking, oh my God, this is the guy. Things just didn't entirely work out. But things are working out in Vancouver, though, hey?
Yeah, absolutely. The Canucks agreed to terms with defenseman Jet Wu on a 1-year, 2-way contract. He had 7 goals and 14 assists for 21 points a season ago. So that's another good ad to have under their belt here. It's still pretty early in the offseason stage, I guess I would say. We've seen some crazy things like what went down with Philadelphia and Columbus and in LA earlier today, but it's never too soon to start getting some of those depth players under contract for next season. Sometimes your most critical additions happen early on in the summer, this time of year. So I think it's good to start locking down some of these guys at this point.
For sure. And some other good news coming out of the NHL now. Of course, the Stanley Cup Finals are going on. It's a great time to recognize that there's lots of development from the AHL now playing in the NHL. For the Vegas Golden Knights, 96% of their players have developed in the AHL. The Florida Panthers, 74%, which is still very, very good. 2 assistant coaches for the Vegas Golden Knights have Calder Cups under their They have their names engraved on those. And on the Florida side, because of that whole checkers deal, there's still some of those kind of players hanging around. Radko Gudas, Alex Lyon, as well as their GM. And they do also have an assistant coach as well who has a Calder Cup ring for per se. And yeah, it's that averages out to about 87%. So good news coming out of the NHL. And while they're doing their finals, the AHL finals are just about to get underway, and of course it's between Hershey and Coachella Valley. I want to start by asking you, Corey, how did the Hershey Bears get here? Recap us that last series if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Bears got here by defeating the Rochester Americans in the Eastern Conference Finals in 6 games. Now it's coming up on, about a week, a little less than a week when by the time this episode goes live, since that series came to a conclusion. But the Bears dispatched the Americans in 6 games. Little bit of a tenuous moment there at the end of the series. The Americans won Game 5 at Giant Center to force the series to 6 games back in their barn. But the Bears got a 1-0 shutout, courtesy of another great bounce back performance for Hunter Shepard. Anytime he's had a bad performance so far, he's in that series, especially, he rebounded with a shutout, right? So there's, no reason to suspect there's a goaltender change on the horizon for the Bears anytime soon, unless something significantly goes off the rails here, I think, in this final round. So the Bears were able to hold Rochester's offense, which was their strength, at bay in this series. The most staggering stat was, I think, they held Rochester's power play to 1 for 15 overall in the series, which is a huge mark considering that's been Rochester's bread and butter. So, the Bears really showed that their defensive game is on another level, I think. And, 6 games, the Bears haven't quite gotten pushed to the limit in any of their series just yet. But, another triumph for the Bears. Rochester is a team, they only played twice, still 2 more times than they played Coachella Valley ever. But, it's certainly a situation where you have to be thankful for what the Bears have accomplished here on both sides of the puck. Not only offensively, but their defense has been stupendous so far. So, I think they're just going to probably keep leaning into that here as we get into this Calder Cup Finals. This evening, I guess, is when it'll start, when this podcast goes live.
For sure. And you talked about that road to the Calder Cup Finals. It wasn't one that was paved with gold either. It had definitely had its ups and downs.
Oh, absolutely. There was 3 different instances in all 3 series that the Bears have played in where they've had to overcome a 2-0 deficit at some point in a game to win that game. In Charlotte, it was Game 4. In the Hartford series, it was Game 1. And now here in Rochester, that would have been, I believe that was, wow, I'm totally blanking on this, but at least in those 2 series, it was a hallmark for the Bears that they were able to come back. And I believe with the Rochester game, that would have been Game 3, if I'm not mistaken. It was a Game 4. I'm blanking. Wow, I should know this. Anyhow, it did happen in the Rochester series. They were down 2-0, stormed back in that third period to take a 2-0 deficit, turned into a 3-2 win. So I do remember that much at least. So, it's been kind of an unlikely hallmark for the Bears. They did not do that a ton over the course of the regular season in terms of overcoming deficits. But you hear Todd Nelson's talking about it at times. He talked about it yesterday when he met with the media. By yesterday, I mean Monday, where he said that, this team is getting closer. These kinds of efforts, the kind of adjustments they've had to make to win these games might not have been able to take place, back around Christmas time, back in the early points of the season. But now this team has had so much time to gel together and to work together, and they're battling for one another. We've really seen them rise to another level here that perhaps might have been their downfall at a different point in the season if they had played that way in a playoff game. And the one quote of Nelson's that stuck out to me was he said that when they lose these games, he would go to them and he would say, "This is how you get eliminated in a playoff series." So it's impressive how much they've taken that to heart and how much that's really kind of helped them gel to this point where they're now 4 wins away from adding a 12th Calder Cup to the team's legacy.
Yeah, no other sport in the world does 76 games or something like that of pure chaos and then 2 months of war. And you know what? I kind of feel like when Coachella Valley came into this series, they kind of came out of a game where the series started off with 2 wins for them, combining for 12 goals. And this is where we've seen the bread and butter of this Coachella Valley team and what they have to offer, which is speed and good puck movement. And let's not count out the Admirals either, who brought up a really good fight, and they kept it close in game 1 and game 2 respectively. And I mean, out-muscled and outgunned, Milwaukee kind of turned on the Jets, really, and they turned it up. And there's no doubt game 3 and 4, and Milwaukee kept them at bay, only keeping them to 3 goals throughout those 2 games, as opposed to 11 in the first 2. And so Coachella Valley would kind of slide by Milwaukee in like a 2-1 game. And so like this series really proved at that point to be a lot closer. And where we start to see it break away is in that sort of final game. And I think the deciding game was one where we started to see the pieces of what each team kind of had to offer. I look back to the second period of that elimination game, and that was kind of Milwaukee's kind of showing of how good they can be. And you also have to remember that they had a lot of reinforcements from Nashville that a lot of other teams, I don't want to say didn't have, but Nashville sent down a lot of pieces down to Milwaukee. And it was a lot closer than what it looked. The 4-3 finisher got them by to where they are today.
Yeah, and you talked about Coachella Valley a little bit. As an Eastern Conference junkie who usually can't stay up late enough to watch many of Coachella Valley's games, my question, Zach, is what do you think that Coachella Valley's biggest strength is? As I've seen, just looking back at all their games that they've, played and won here, you see a lot of games where they score 5 or more goals, and I started to think it's reminiscent of kind of like Rochester. What do you think is really their strength? Is it just purely goal scoring? Is it a little bit of everything? What particularly do they excel at in your mind?
I think it is goal scoring, and I'll take you back to if people can actually remember this, Coachella Valley long eons ago faced off against the Tucson Roadrunners. And that's how they kind of started out their playoffs, where they started there. And, you could tell that their defense was kind of right. But what we really started to see was their goal scoring prowess. And I say that because in the first 10 minutes, they scored like 4 goals on them. Right. I think it was 3 or 4. And so that was kind of like, okay, these guys know how to bust in and get through. And we started to see more of that, even though that they didn't have the shot clock on their side in a lot of cases or whatnot. And that's kind of what got them through, or almost didn't get them through the first round, because the series was tied at 1 game apiece, and it's a best 2 out of 3 here, right? And so they did manage to come away by scoring those goals, but that was like your first, oh my God, you almost slipped it there. And we also did see that in the Colorado series a lot, where they kind of came out and, once teams started figuring out their defense, that's when we started seeing the question marks. And I mean, but all the same, it was a totally different team than what we seen against Calgary, and which is what I'm really expecting out of this Coachella Valley team when they go up against Hershey, because I do think that Hershey and Calgary, I don't want to say are on the same scale, but they're kind of in that A tier of teams throughout the regular season. And that's, if you're basing it off of that going into the playoffs, well, that's where I kind of see them. So they went through Calgary. We talked about Milwaukee, and that's what got them here. I'll ask you, Corey, who should we be looking out for on this Hershey team?
It's kind of an interesting question. You told me to start thinking about that before we started recording. And the answer I kind of came back with is almost anybody and everybody at this point. It's such an atypical year. I mean, you think back to, teams of Hershey's past, like the 2010 team, you would say Keith Aucoin, Alex Drew, John Carlson, and you still have some of those big names like Connor McMichael, Hendrix Lapierre, Alexei Protas is another one. But it hasn't just been those guys, and that's kind of what is intriguing about this Hershey team. A lot of the games, like the game winner for Hershey, the series winner was Shane Gersich. It was his first goal of the playoffs, his second playoff goal he's ever scored in his career, type of thing. He was the guy that was able to break through. Beck Mallenstein's the guy that's come up with a clutch goal. That fourth line has been so strong. And then when none of those guys were able to put the puck in the net, you got so many goals from Logan Day. It's hard to keep track of sometimes. And he's a guy who didn't score a single goal from the blue line at all in the regular season. So it's a tough one to pin down one guy to say, hey, this is the guy the bulletin board material. And obviously, I would probably look towards a Connor McMichael, Mike Scarbosa if he were playing, but he's been out injured type of thing. So everybody's kind of been pulling on that rope together. And, I think that Hershey's strength really lies in their defense and being able to counterpunch through that defense. So it's a little bit hard to pick on one guy to say, yeah, this is the guy that you're going to watch bury the puck in the back of the net. You can make some good bets, but you really can't rule out anybody. And that's what's kind of been awesome about this team.
How much has that injury bug affected Hershey, or not at all?
Well, they've done a good job of not showing it. When Mike Scarbosa went down, Henrik Borgstrom stepped up and took his spot in the top line. And he's been, it's been almost seamless. You wouldn't even notice it. Borgstrom came in and his first 2 goals were game winners. And he's starting to wonder, where was this guy the whole time, And that's what the beauty of it is. When one guy goes down, another guy steps up. It started to show itself a little bit in the Rochester series. In my mind, there was some injury issues, and they moved Ethan Frank around to a different line, and it kind of hurt the composition of those lines, which has been pretty set at times. So, and they kind of went back to that once Borgstrom was healthy again in Game 6. So my kind of thought towards the end of it is that they'll probably ice a similar lineup. I would like to think if Scarbosa can play, he will, but to my knowledge, I don't believe he's practiced at all since that injury he had at the end of the Charlotte series. So I think you're probably going to see a similar lineup and probably just, no changes across the board in that respect.
And I look at the Coachella roster and I'm thinking, this is a solid team. This is a deep playoff team. And just by looking at some of their names, and I was kind of in a similar boat. I kind of had this sort of thing in my mind where I was like, okay, I need to dummy this list down to say, 5. And I was thinking, this is hard to kind of like get down to 5, because I'm looking at the team and there's a great mix of some really old talent and some really new talent as well, right? I look at the young guys, there's no denying Cartier. Shane Wright has been here, maybe not the Shane Wright that is advertised completely. I think he's doing pretty good. And then there's Cole Lind, who's absolutely just lighting it up here, right? And I kind of look at him and I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy's got it, right? But you also got those old wily vets, right? Like Mike, look at McCarron. He's been around the league for quite some time. And so that's where I kind of look. And I also look at Joey Decord, who's really been holding them down to kind of get to this point, right? There was times where I was like, but he's kind of bailed them out of some really tough situations. And I think that what we're going to see is a lot of tough situations in this Hershey series coming up, where I think that they're going to kind of have to go back to their ways against where they were against Calgary again. I'll go back to it, because that's where we've seen some peak hockey. We really did that. The overtimes were one thing, right? So that's where I would kind of be looking at for them, at least.
And it is interesting too. There's a lot of crossover I noted from that, 1 year dual affiliation with the Charlotte Checkers that, Seattle kind of had in their inception last year. Well, there's a lot of guys there that, I remember from, playing Charlotte 8 times last year with the Bears, the Decords, the McCormicks, the, Alexander Trues of the world there were all guys where, I'm like, oh man, that guy burned us. Oh man, Joey Decord stopped so many shots in a couple of games there. It's one of those things. And, they have Eddie Whitco, who, played 3 seasons with the Bears and, finds himself on the other side now with Coachella Valley. There's a few great stories that's kind of hidden in there, for, a quote brand new matchup. It's, not so brand new when you look at it, a little bit beneath the surface in those respects.
Yeah, and I remember Eddie too. I think it was the Eagles series. And like once he found his game, I think he scored 3 points that night, or 2 goals and an assist, right? And I think that like once he kind of finds, I think he's like a hidden gem of someone who could step up when needed, right? And it was desperately needed at that time in the Eagles series. And I think that he does have a lot of potential in that in this series as well as kind of a dark horse. There's so many different shining pieces on that squad. You kind of sometimes get lost in that. So that's for sure.
And Eddie's a guy that he reminds me a little bit of Dylan McElrath in a lot of ways. That he's just one of those guys where it's like you don't want to be, if you see him bearing down on you for a hit. We saw in the Rochester series in Game 5 where Dylan McElrath just steamrolled someone. It was such a heavy hit that the guy's helmet flew up and went over the glass and into the seats, type of thing. So you got a couple of those heavy quantity guys, and just from having seen Eddie for 3 seasons in Hershey, he is a guy that he lays the boom down with heavy hits. It seems like they finally figured out that should be playing one position, and that's playing defense. I mean, he wasn't bad as a fourth liner. The Bears kind of dealt him a tough hand, I think, with the way their roster is situated his last year. But he was playing forward, and he was pretty great in terms of his forecheck and how he was able to pressure on the forecheck and things like that. So I really do like that he's found a home there. I'm happy for him, but this series maybe not a little bit less. I'm saying that now, but when the puck drops, it's gonna be a different story. But it seems like he's really fit in there. And there's, like you said, there's a lot of great stories there for some of these guys. We haven't even talked about Andrew Podorowski, who's in his 3rd straight Calder Cup Finals appearance. Like somebody's got to stop this guy eventually, and his teams that he's on. So
he's like the Pat Maroon.
Exactly.
He is the Pat Maroon. And I was trying not to bring him up because I know that I was waiting to see how long before someone brought it up. And I was waiting for Andrew to come by in the chat because I think he can hear the Podorowski and it's, kind of deal, right?
It's a bat signal.
Yeah, it's the bat signal. And he's had a lot of clutch moments. I think in that Calgary series, he had the deciding game there, the winner, and he was solid in that last series as well. Again, and I'm sure that you kind of look to some of that Calder Cup experience as well, right? Someone who knows how to take a run deep, right? And so that's where I kind of look for him. And there is a lot of good stars on both of these clubs, Corey. But like, what does Hershey have to do to win?
To me, it's that team defense we were talking about before. That Coachella Valley. What intimidated me about it when I was looking at their stats, being kind of an outsider to their game in that respect, is that this team hangs a lot of goals up on their opponents. I think I counted 9 of their 18 games, 8 or 9 games at least, that they had scored like 5 or more goals, right? And that's kind of been the big key for Hershey just throughout this playoff, is that they've gone against some very high-flying offensive teams. Rochester, obviously, had a boatload of goals going into that series, hanging up a lot on the Marlies and, some teams that preceded them. As had Hartford, they were a team that kind of steamrolled their way into this point, beating Providence, which still seems unfathomable in a sense, even when I look back at it now. But it's Hershey's just got to be able to continue doing their hard work in limiting offense, whether it's blocking shots, keeping guys to the outside. They really just seem to find this formula, and I expect there to be some adjustments be made, like how it was in the Rochester series. They lost Game 1, they had to make some on the fly adjustments, and bounce back in Game 2 in a lot of ways. So I think if they're able to enforce that style, where it's kind of this war of attrition, where they can get 1, 2, 3 goals and limit them to just 2. I mean, Hunter Shepard's only given up 2 or more goals twice in these playoffs. I think that's how they stand a really good chance of winning this series, and they've been able to do it. But just like with Rochester, it's a different kind of team. You talked about how all the veterans, the young talent, they have one of those perfect championship matrices type of thing, in that they have just such a solid composition. So I think it's really going to represent Hershey's biggest challenge yet in that respect. And it'll be interesting to see if it can hold together in that sense. But, I do think that for them, I worry about them only in the sense when they give up the first goal. Just because you're asking to not only hold them at bay, but you're also asking for a comeback. They've been able to do it a couple of times, but I'm like, say to myself, make it easy on yourselves when this happens, right? Like nobody wants to be chasing a game 2-0, anything like that all the time. It as the teams get better, it's just less likely it's going to happen. Now, the flip side with Coachella Valley is that they have given up a few goals at times too, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen every single time, right? Like we saw with Milwaukee, they ended up getting pretty close at a 4-3 final score in game 6 when they, were eliminated. So they did get some scoring there. So I think for the Bears, it's going to be capitalizing on the opportunities, not throwing duds like they did in game 5 and game 1 against Rochester, but just kind of bringing that complete game, but starting on defense is the most important aspect for me.
For sure. And I was kind of thinking about Coachella Valley too. And the first thing I kind of thought of is how offensively heavy this team is. Right. I feel like there's a lot of times where even the defense is kind of playing a little more offensively than what they almost should be at times. And I think that's kind of my big thing for them is, let's keep the offense there, but let's hold the line on the defense a little bit here. So there was often times where I feel like they were almost letting their opponents kind of dump it in or like get so far hoping that they would dump it in. I think that one of the big things for them is they need to hold the line because I think Hershey will hold them accountable for it. And because I think once Hershey kind of gets in, they kind of have this lock in, right? I feel like there's a lot of times where they kind of set up this offensive zone. I don't want to say trap, but like there's definitely a certain way that they'll kind of get defense moving in ways that they probably shouldn't. And I think that's one of the true things that you need to remember with this team is you need to stick to what you know, right? And let's stick to our own game defensively at that, right? Let's make sure that we're holding the line here at the blue line. We're making sure that they're not coming in and then using that to kind of push forward on offense like they've been doing all season, all playoffs long, because it's been proven, I think it has been proven that their offense isn't the problem. It's really boils down to their defense, which almost lost them the series against Tucson and at times almost lost them the series against Milwaukee as well, right? They did tighten that up heavily as much as they could in that Calgary series. But, I kind of got to think about it and say, you know what, let's hold the line on the defense and let's make sure that Hershey just doesn't get into the zone.
I agree, and that's kind of my big thing with Hershey's that I worry about them offensively at times. Now they've proven me wrong a few times. You get some goals from unlikely sources, and when everyone's pulling on the rope like that, that makes them a wily opponent, even if they're not scoring a boatload of goals. It was funny looking at the stats for it because Coachella Valley's top scorer has almost double. I think it's Cole Lind, if I'm not mistaken, has almost double as many points as Hershey's leading scorer, Alexei Protas. I think it was a 23-12 margin, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
And it's just one of those ones where it's like, wow, that's an impressive stat. Obviously, Coachella Valley's had the hard route, so to speak, of playing the max amount of games as well as the play-in round. That has been a very impressive element of them getting to this point. But you almost kind of wonder to yourself, is this sustainable for them, right? Like they've been pushed to the brink. They've shown that when they get pushed to the brink, they push back, right? Like it's an impressive trait to have. But you always just kind of wonder on both sides, will they be able to sustain this? Is it going to be too much of a shell shock playing against a different kind of beast? Now, obviously, with the Pacific and the Atlantic, they're probably the most isolated divisions in the league, in that there's not really a lot of crossover between. There's more crossover between like the Central or the North than there is really the Atlantic and the Pacific. To the point where I would guess that in this era, this is probably the first matchup of a Pacific and an Atlantic team ever. If my memory, is not failing me, and obviously I don't know everything. At least for Hershey, it's their first Pacific division. It's their first. It was a great fact. Jesse Liebman from the Bears staff came up with this stat. The Bears have not played a California-based team in 55 years since 1968.
Wow.
Is your stat. It was another team called the San Diego Gulls. No relation of any kind to the modern team, of course. But it's been that long. So you wonder, obviously there's some known quantities to them team-wise. We've seen Dan Bilesma coach a Pennsylvania-based team before. Some very familiar elements there, but it's a different matrix. It's a different combination. Every team formulates. He doesn't have a Sidney Crosby in this instance. Obviously Andrew Podorowski's not too far off in some ways at this level. So, it's one of those things. It's known, but yet it's unknown. I just wonder which team is going to be the first to take advantage of that versus how the series plays out long term. Like, who's going to make that adjustment that's going to turn a 1-0 series lead into a deficit, or if someone, heaven forbid, gets overconfident possibly. So that's just kind of two scenarios that's kind of rattling around in my head in thinking about this, just as it's such an unusual matchup.
For sure. I'll tell you a good story about the San Diego Gulls right before we finish the episode. But, I was kind of thinking about that too. How much of an effect does this kind of long schedule have on the Coachella Valley Firebirds? And, they were in a relatively tough division, but, they also had San Diego in that division as well. So how tough can it be? There's kind of two sides to that coin, I guess. But yeah, that's where I was kind of thinking. And like, you also have to think that these guys have been tested, and I'm sure us as a podcast will be back before this elimination game. I hope we will. But and that's one thing about Coachella Valley, and you said it best. When they get pushed to the limit, they often will push back. And they dominated against Tucson, and they dominated against Calgary in both of those elimination games. Well, I don't want to say they dominated, because that was a truly spectacular game. But, and that's a great point as well. So if this series goes deep, there's kind of two sides to that coin, on one side, Coachella Valley has pushed back. On the other side, this has been a long, long year for them. And we also have to, I think it's great to acknowledge too that these guys started out the season on the road. Remember, these guys spent like the first 3 months on the road, and they played like all road games for the most part. They played 1 or 2 games at the Climate Pledge, and that was it. So
home games, in air quotes.
Yeah, and I mean, like, again, I even too, the Pacific Division doesn't really do many favors in terms of travel either, right? It's not entirely close. I guess none of them really are, but it doesn't really help it either that they're not all in New York State for the most part. But here
they certainly don't have any Lehigh Valley or Wilkes-Barre kind of trips, as in that same relationship as Hershey does. That's for sure.
For sure. I do want to talk about that playoff schedule, because there's a pretty solid one for the finals. One cool thing that I almost thought that they would kind of do, all the games start at 7 local. I kind of thought that they would kind of do like an NHL sort of deal where, we might get like a couple like half early, half late kind of starts. No. We're all starting at 7 local. So 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 Pacific on June 8th. That first game is game 1 in Coachella Valley. Game 2 is on June 10th, 7 p.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. Eastern rather, 7 p.m. Pacific. Let me get that right. And that's in Coachella Valley. Things will shift over to the Giant Center. And that's where we see June 13th. That's 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific. That's in Hershey. The next game also in Hershey as well. So it's a 2-3-2. June 15th, 7 Eastern, 4 Pacific at the Giant Center. Now, the next ones are, if necessary, folks, June 17th, 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 Pacific at the Giant Center. Then we go back to Coachella Valley again, if necessary, 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific local time. And that's at Coachella Valley on the 19th of June. And on the 21st of June, wow, it's relatively late. But it's a 10 p.m. start for the Eastern time, folks, 7 p.m. Pacific, and that's in Coachella Valley. A lot of long nights for Hershey fans, I think.
The bags are already forming under my eyes just hearing the words 10 p.m. start time. I've done it before to stay up, when the Flyers go out west and stuff like that. I've tried to tune into those games, but like I tried to stay up for the Milwaukee series finale last night. I fell asleep in the third period, man. Like, this is going to be hard for me. Oh,
And of course, obviously the stats out there, but this isn't the furthest AHL Calder Cup ever, and this isn't the biggest leap in time ever. It's tied at 3 time zones in difference. Actually, no, it is the biggest leap in time, I do think, because I think there's a couple half-hour time zones in that other 2014 series. But yeah, definitely the up there on one of the furthest. You know, something that just may be a stretch are our opinions. But I want to ask you, Corey, are you given a series prediction or are you gonna veto this question?
well, I've thought about it long. I've thought about it hard. I'm taking Hershey in 6.
Okay.
A little bold. I know, I've seen a few predictions out there, and to me, I've seen this team with their defense. They've shut down, if there's any team that coming into the conference finals was as potent of offense, I feel like Rochester may have been the most potent offensive team that we've seen. And, Hershey, credit to them where it's due. They took their lumps in the first game. And it was that response that was what sold me. Is the Rochester series was like I said, this is where their strategy is going to make or break. Not that that's not putting any slight towards what Hartford or Charlotte did. They both had tough roads to this point and were true tests in their own way. But those tests, all combine in some ways to me to say if this Hershey team can, sweep a Hartford team that beat the top team in the East, and B, stop a Rochester team that was absolutely money. I mean, Yuri Kulich had a goal in every single game leading up to the conference final, and he only scored 1 goal the whole series, and it was a preventable goal. If I'm sure Hunter Shepard would tell you that he, could have had the goal that he scored type of thing. It was just one of those things where it was remarkable, and I think it gets kind of swept under the rug a little bit overall on how well Hershey's system has been disrupting teams. And for me, I just see that, once the Bears kind of say, if they can kind of get over the hump a little bit early and say, hey, we can do this type of thing, get a little success. My big thing is that, right, like the Bears haven't won a game in the Calder Cup Finals since 2010 when they won it last, right? So I've been sitting here like, okay, I'm going to feel confident once that monkey's off my back type of thing. But once the Bears kind of get there, and see that I can sense that they would smell blood in the water. I think Coachella Valley is going to push hard, and obviously, they play well on home ice. They've gotten a lot of their wins at home, as Hershey has, but Hershey's been a beast, a different kind of animal almost on the road as well. 6-0. That's kind of an underappreciated stat, at least by the rest of people. Not to me, because the road was always kind of a little bit of a sore spot. The team got better at as the year went on. So I just really feel that Hershey is going to, find that element to their game. And not that it's going to be too much for Coachella, but it's going to be probably a mighty test for them in that respect, just because both those series were really similar in that respect. Calgary was just as good and lost by 1 goal type of thing. We talked so much about how strong their goaltending's been, but Hershey, for my money, I think has just the most well-rounded team that I've seen in a long time. And I think it's going to be close. I think we would be talking about a game 7 for quite some time leading up to this, but I think that Hershey may be able to pull this off in 6.
So I'm kind of, I do think that this is going to go deep, right? And there's only one answer when it goes deep, and to me that's Coachella Valley, and they've kind of proven that before. And I think that this is going to go 7 games, and I think that it's going to be Coachella Valley, but I think this is going to be a lot closer of a series than what we were kind of expecting. You know what I mean? Like I do think that this is kind of going to be one of the things where they're going to be looking at a way to kind of bust through Hershey for a lot of it. And I think that they're going to try to find a way to crack that coconut, really, to be honest. And so do I think that it's going to be blowout? No. I think that it's just going to be a 7-game series where it's going to be Coachella Valley taking it there. So I hope for your sake that I'm wrong, because I think that deep down he's gonna kill me. But otherwise, I think that for sure, I do think that it's going to be Coachella Valley taking this one.
Well, I mean, it's a fair point. That's kind of the counterpunch here, right? Like I'm obviously, I obviously have my chocolate covered glasses on all the time, but the thing that kind of always sticks out to me is that that's the big thing with Coachella Valley, right? Is that they have such a veteran laden, experience driven team that that's the one element I think they do have over Hershey. Is that, if I to my knowledge, I believe that the handful of players that have been beyond a few rounds, especially Calder Cup winners, has been few. I mean, you think of the guys like Aaron Ness, Dylan McElrath, and Sam Annis come to mind. Only one of those guys has a Calder Cup, and that's Dylan McElrath. But the kind of good news is that him and Todd Nelson have been there before. They've done it before with the Grand Rapids Griffins. But that is the element that kind of gets me, is that I think if it turns into a one shot, two shot kind of game, that's where I think Coachella Valley can really turn the series in their favor. And I agree with you, though. I want Hershey in 6, because I think if it's in 7, I'm concerned a little bit more if I'm, speculating that, just because like we said, they've been there, they've done that, they've pushed, they get better, it seems like, when it goes the distance. So that's kind of my, alternate hot take, is that I want it in 6 because I don't want to go to 7. We'll put it that way.
Well, folks, any final thoughts before we leave you to enjoy game 1, Corey?
I'm nervous, man. I'm bubbling with excitement, but I am nervous. I have not been this nervous about a game in a long time. So I'm excited. I'm optimistic, but you always have to keep it measured, and I'm just hoping it's some really good hockey the whole way out.
I remember I was in St. John's in 2014 for the Calder Cup, and that was the only time that I was old enough to kind of know about it or whatever. But there was a strange buzz. And there's kind of that same sort of buzz in 2019 when the Newfoundland Growlers of the ECHL won it. And, you just kind of felt this overall excitement of everybody remembers where they were the night that they won, right? And I'm sure for a lot of Hershey Bears fans, they kind of feel that exact same way. I'll leave the episode with one story before we go. During the 1960s and 70s, the Boston Bruins actually had a strange sort of affiliation with the San Diego Gulls. And they actually did this for one reason, which I think was part of it. The San Diego Gulls transformed their arena to have the same dimensions as the Boston Garden. So when you got called up from San Diego, you actually went to the same playing surface dimensions, which everybody knows the Boston Garden was notorious for its terrible ice dimensions, but San Diego mirrored that, and that's the story of that. And they're actually playing in the same sort of arena that has been since very refurbished. But yes, that's my one good story about San Diego. Well, folks, this has been quite the episode. We hope that we kind of enlighten you on what the series is about to be for the Coachella Valley Firebirds taking on the Hershey Bears. And again, we really do want to thank you so much for tuning in. In the meantime, you can check out some of our other podcasts. Join Matthew Harding and Jason Miles as they break down the ECHL's Wichita Thunder, and they'll talk to some of the team's legendary players on the Rolling Thunder bi-weekly podcast. Another solid podcast. Alexandra Ackerman hosts Syracuse Speaks. Of course, she kind of gave a little bit of a eulogy towards the end of their season, which did kind of end at the hands of the Rochester Americans, but it was a very well-fought series as well. I do recommend you listening to that podcast as well. And you can also check us out on Twitter at the Holy GrAHL, and GrAHL is spelled GRAHL, and you already knew that. On behalf of all of us here at Field Pass Hockey and the Holy GrAHL, I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again next time.
This has been the Holy GrAHL Podcast. Have a question or a topic suggestion? Hit us up on Twitter or drop us an email. For the latest news across the American Hockey League and the rest of minor league hockey, download the Field Pass Hockey app, now available in the Apple and Android app stores.